Hi everyone, today I'm going to take you through how to paint this sunset window painting. You're going to need a few different brushes, a round brush, a flat brush, and then maybe a larger brush, there they are, a round brush to make sure that you can blend the background. You're also going to need some painter's tape and 2 pots of water, and these are some of the colors that I used. You can choose to use matte colors rather than neon colors. Sometimes neons can be a little bit transparent. And I also used these two, the cool red and the magenta. Now, your very first step, as you can see here, I have drawn on the window shape. You do not have to do that, that's optional. But the first thing you need to do is color in the edges black and then create that cross in the middle. After that, you need to pick up your white paint and start to give it some texture. So you'll notice I'm sticking to sort of one side. I'm looking at where the light is coming from. The light is probably going to be shining through the window panes, so that's where I've sort of tried to place my white. As it dries, you'll see that it'll start to give you some nice texture to start looking a little bit more like wood. And one thing about this is it's nice because as it's drying, you can use your white and it'll sort of mix in and make a little bit of a grey colour. And then down the bottom, I've done some diagonal strokes to make it look a little bit more like a windowsill, because we'll put something there at the end, maybe a little vase with some flowers. So your first 2 steps are nice and simple. If you'd like to draw on the windowsill, you can, just to give you a guide. And then you need to paint the edges black, create that cross, and then put some white there for some texture. Now, the next thing you need to do is protect all of that wonderful work that you've just done, and using your painter's tape, cover over it. And not only will that protect what we've done, that will also give you some nice sharp lines. So once you've done that, you can block in some white if you want to make sure none of that black gets in the way, or you can see through the paint, but you should probably be okay. Now I've grabbed some purple paint and I've started at the top and also painted some purple at the bottom. I've used my darkest color first, and you're going to want to use different brushes for this so that your colors can blend nicely. So once you've covered the top and the bottom with your darkest color, or in this case, it's my purple color, then the next thing you're going to want to do while it's still wet so you can blend is get your next lightest color, and my next lightest color is an orange color. If I'm going a little bit too fast for you, you can always rewind or pause and see what I'm doing. So as you can see, I've picked up a completely clean brush and I've mixed in some fluoro pink and fluoro orange together. You'll need to layer, if you're using fluoros, you'll need to layer it a little bit just so you can get that really bright color. So all I've done is started at the top or near the center of my painting and worked the light color into the dark. You can see me doing that there. If you work the light into the dark, then you won't pull the dark down quite as much. It's easy to mix a light color into a dark color, but once you start mixing the dark color into the light color, it gets a little bit more tricky. You'll see that this is why I have 2 different water pots. So you don't need to clean them as much, but you can make sure that you get your brush nice and clean. So I'm going to do a couple more layers. You probably won't see it all, but I'm going to do a couple more layers just to make sure it's nice and vibrant and they're blended together. Keep in mind, you do need to do that before it dries, because acrylic dries quite quickly. Now in the middle, I've used a 3rd clean brush and I'm using my lightest color, which is my yellow. And I've started in the middle where the white is, and then I'm blending it up into the orange. And then pulling it a little bit back down so some of that orange goes into the yellow, and then making sure I clean my brush, because as soon as you start to get the orange mixed in with the yellow in the middle, it'll all start to blend into one color, and we want to keep them nice and separate. So I've cleaned my brush completely, putting more yellow paint on, and then I'm going to color in that white bit and work it all the way down. Now what I've got here is what we call a dry brush. So it's quite a soft consistency. And if you can see, as I'm painting over that, it sort of just smooths everything out a little bit. If you're not using fluoros, or neon paints, you'll find that this process might be a little bit easier because it's not quite as transparent. But I've just used that dry brush just to blend it in that little bit more. So now we have our sunset background. So just as a reminder, start at the top with your darkest colors, use a clean brush, then use your second lightest color and blend that in. Make sure that you start with the white and then blend down into the dark color, and then use your lightest color in the middle. What I'm doing now is a few different mountains in the background, starting on our scenery. I've started with a sort of medium purple color or a violet color, which is quite similar to the tops and the bottom of the painting. If you have a look at my palette, you can see I've got quite a dark violet there, and I'm mixing in a little bit of white just to create a lighter color. And at the top of these mountains, we'll need to do a bit of lighter violet highlights, and I'll mix in a little bit more white when I do that. And then I'm using that dark violet, I've picked it up just now, and I've used that dark violet color as the shadows towards the bottom of the mountain. Now these mountains are in the background, so they don't need to be really detailed, because the further something is from our eye line, the less detail that's in it, and usually the lighter it is. So I have done a little bit of shadowing at the bottom of those mountains, but I will lighten them up a little bit, because in the distance, things do become lighter and smaller. Remember that you can do a couple of different things. Now the horizon line is actually behind the sticky tape, so I'm not too concerned about making the skyline or drawing in the horizon, because it's actually hidden by the window frame. And the reason why we've done mirrored colors is because the top is the sky and the bottom is reflected in the water, and we will do a little bit of the sun in a minute. So I've gone over to the other sides. I start with my sort of medium color. So this is that medium purple that I'm starting with to get the shape of the mountains, and then picking up some white for the highlights at the top of the mountain where the light hits it, and then the dark violet at the bottom where the shadows are. I'm just using a flat brush here, and I'm just dabbing away to give it that little bit of texture. Your mountains might look slightly different, and that's okay. The important thing to note is in nature, nothing is really symmetrical, so it's good to try and change it up a little bit. I've got one mountain that's smaller than the other. I've got a little bit more light on one mountain. But once you have your basic shape, then you just need some shadow at the bottom, which is what I'm doing now with that dark violet color. And then I will do some white highlights at the top, and that will give us that perspective and that depth. If you wanted to change these colors entirely, if you wanted to do a more traditional sunset and you wanted to use red and orange and yellow, you could absolutely do that as well. If you wanted to make it a night sky or the afternoon, and you wanted to use a dark blue and a light blue and a white color, you could absolutely do that as well. I just really like the vibrant colors. Don't be afraid to have a go of the neon colors. You just need to keep in mind that they do tend to need a little bit more layering. And the other tip using neons is to make sure that you're using them on a white background rather than any other color, because otherwise they just won't be quite as vibrant. I've just tried to make it, so I'm just doing the finishing touches on that mountain now. I've just tried to make it so that we have some dark, and then we have some of the medium purple, and then we have some of the highlights at the top, and they all sort of blend in together. Keeping in mind that in the distance, things should look a little bit lighter and with a little bit less detail and a little bit smaller. And that's the beginnings of our horizon. Acrylics are quite forgiving, so if you wanted to go over those mountains, or if you wanted to let them dry a little bit and then add a little bit more white, you can absolutely do that. Now what I'm doing is a little bit of the mountain's reflection in the water. I've used a lighter violet color, which is that dark violet color with a little bit of white mixed into it. You can see on my palette, I'm using it there. And the purple shadowing will be lighter in the background, and then it will become darker. So what I'm doing now is laying down just the general waterline that I'm after. And again, try not to make them too even. You want things to look a little bit uneven. That's what nature's like. Nature tends to be not too symmetrical. Once I've done that on both sides, then I will do some dark shadows towards the bottom, because the closer something is, the darker it is. And then at the back will be a little bit lighter. I'm using that same dark violet color for all of this work, including the top and the bottom of the painting. If you go back to the beginning and you have a look at the different paint colors I used, you'll see that dark violet. All I've done is mixed in a little bit of white to create that lighter color. And then if I want lighter again, I'll wash my brush, dab it in a little bit of white, a tiny bit of that purple, and then we have our highlights. I'm just smoothing it out a little bit here so that the edges are a little bit softer. The edges of that shadow on the water and the reflection of the mountains are a little bit softer. If you wait for your layers to dry, sometimes it is a little bit easier. With acrylics, some things are easier to do when the paint is still wet, and then some things are a little bit easier to do when you wait for it to dry a little bit. So what I'm doing here is adding in some of that dark violet color. So we'll get it to fade, so it'll be quite dark at the front, and then as it goes back into the distance, not only do things in the distance tend to get a little bit lighter and with a little bit less detail, but also the light source that we have is coming from the setting sun. So the most light would be in the distance where the horizon is, and then as the light fades and as we get closer, it'll be a little bit darker. Now at the top, I've mixed in a little bit more white. You can see that's a lighter violet color. So I've mixed in a little bit more white to create that brighter line near where the light source is coming from, and that's a little bit further away. And also, the closer you get to the center, at the back and at the center, that will also be a little bit lighter because that's where the sun's coming from. Right down the bottom, I'm just doing a little bit of the dark violet to create a little bit of contrast and fade the light color all the way into something that's a little bit darker and a little bit more shadowy. One of the most exciting moments of doing a painting like this is when you get to peel off the sticky tape, and you can really see the painting start to come together when that happens. Now I'm drawing some branches for some trees. I'm going to do 4 different trees, and all I've done here is use just black to create a silhouette rather than you can, if you wanted to use brown, make a brown branches, and create something that is a little bit more traditional, you can. I just thought the dramatic black silhouette against the black window frame that we painted, the very first step, the very first thing that we did, would be quite nice. And all you need to do, I'm using a round brush here. So a round brush is round and it has sort of a pointy tip, for those of you who are new to painting. And to create the trunk, I press down, I load up my brush with quite a lot of black paint, and I press down a little bit harder so that we create that wide trunk. And then I lighten my grip and pull away a little bit from the canvas as I get to the tips. And the branches I'm pressing very, very lightly. So I'm loading my brush and pressing very lightly using that sharp tip of the round brush. And from those, you just create a few different branches. With this tutorial, I decided I wanted to show you how you can draw the window frame first and then draw the background using the painter's tape. Painter's tape is one of my favorite tools to use. It gives you really sharp lines and it's quite versatile, and it really does protect the paint, all the work that we've done under there with that frame. You'll see when I pull off the tape just how resilient it is. There's no bleeding, and I know it might look quite wet, but once we pull it off, it'll look really great. If you don't have painter's tape, you can certainly still do this painting. If you draw your lines like I did at the beginning and use them as a guide, you could certainly do that as well. I just think using painter's tape is a little bit more fun because you don't have to worry about staying inside lines or trying to get straight lines, and you can really just go for it. And I think once you peel the tape off, it looks a little bit more authentic because you've got these little bits that are hidden under the window pane. Whereas if you're sort of painting around it, sometimes it's difficult to get that authentic look of the window pane covering the background behind it. So I've created all 4 of my little tree branches. So I've got my trunks and I've got all my branches. The next thing we're going to do is put some leaves on it. I have a brush that's quite rough, and you'll see it in a minute. It's quite rough and it has sort of a point on it. Sometimes those shabby brushes, the ones that you've been using over and over again, are really great for leaves because when you dab them on, all those little leaves start to look different, and that's what we want when we're painting something to do with nature. We don't want everything to look the same. So the last thing I'm going to do in the background before I put the leaves on, so that we don't have to go back and do it later. And so when you're painting, you kind of need to work from the background all the way to the foreground. And this is in the background. I'm just using some neon yellow to create that last bit of sunshine. It's just that last bit of those ray of lights that are coming over the horizon. And remembering that the bottom of the painting is a reflection of the sky. So what I will do in a minute is create a sun, so that's sort of a round sun. And sometimes one of the best painting tools you can have are your fingers. So I will put some paint down there and create the shape that I want, and while it's still wet, I'll use my finger to blend it. But that contrast of the yellow and the orange and the pink is really nice. It creates that little bit of a dramatic effect. And I find that the violet really is quite complementary. In this particular tutorial, I've created the frame first, the window frame first. Maybe in the next tutorial I'll show you how you can do a painting like this and then do the frame last. And again, it's not essential to have painter's tape, but I think it's a really great tool to not just create those sharp lines which look really lovely, but that way you can protect what you've done, or you can create different layers or different lines, and it's just a nice convenient way to be able to paint freely. Because as it is, if we look at what I'm doing now, I don't have to worry about staying inside the lines. I don't have to worry about where the window pane is. I'm just going for it and just drawing the sun as it is. And then when we peel off those pieces of painter's tape, we'll get a really nice dramatic look. So I've done my sun at the top, and you see I'm using my finger just to sort of rub it in so that we can get a nice fade. And try and make it as accurate as you can, so the top should look the same as the bottom. And then we've got that sun fading, and we've got that beautiful reflection underneath. The last thing that we're going to do for the background is the leaves on the tree. And once I've finished doing a few little yellow highlights, so I've just done some yellow highlights because that's where the sun's rays are hitting. This was the brush I was talking about. It's quite shabby and it's quite pointy, but it's great for doing leaves. All I've done here with the color is there's two colors at the beginning. There was a cool red and a magenta, and I've mixed those two together, and this is the darkest color. If you look on my palette to the right of that pink magenta color I am using, there is a lighter version. All I've done is take that red and magenta that I've mixed up and added a little bit of white to it, and then that will be the highlights for our trees. When you do your leaves, try and leave some of those branches transparent. It's nice to be able to see the branches, and a lot of the time, if you have a look at some of the trees outside in your backyard or on the street, you will find that you can see a lot of the branches. And I'm not going too far down the trunk either. I want to leave some of the trunk there, which is what a lot of trees tend to look like. All I'm doing is tapping around the branches and then just stopping at the top of those branches so that we have all those leaves. And again, if you wanted to be really dramatic and use a different color for the trees, I don't know, maybe you wanted to use maybe a blue color, or if you wanted to be a bit more traditional and use green, you could do that. I just think the magenta complements the violet and the orange and the yellow that we've used. All right, now I'm using that same magenta color that I used for the background, and I'm doing some highlights. All I've done is add some white. And when you're doing highlights of trees, again, it's where the light hits them. So the most light you're going to get are usually at the top and on the tips of the tree. I don't want to do too many because you don't want to lose that lovely depth and that lovely darker magenta as well. See how I'm just doing the highlights mostly on the tips? Because if we think about where the sun is, most of the light will be hitting those leaves at the tips and at the tops of the tree. And we don't want them too even, so I'm trying to do them so some of them go different ways and they look a little bit uneven, because that's what leaves in nature look like. I've added a few darker ones right at the bottom for some shadow, and I've just used black. Just black to create that little bit more of a dramatic effect. And the last thing I'm going to do with those trees is also put a few little white highlights just to create that bit more of a contrast. The more contrast you can create when you're painting, the more vibrant and the more dramatic it tends to look. Now I've got my white, and right on the tips, not losing any of that dark magenta and not losing too much of those lighter pink magenta highlights. Just a little bit more. It's those little finishing touches and those details that really start to make the painting come to life. So just as a reminder tip, it's always a good idea to start with the background. So I started with the sky and blending that and creating that reflection. Then I went to the mountains and the sun in the background, and then I did the trees. Now this is the really satisfying part, when you get to pull off the sticky tape, the painter's tape. So you can see already that there's a beautiful sharp line there. None of the paint has bled onto the frame. And once you peel it off, you'll start to see the painting really come together. Now, working from the background all the way to the foreground, there are a couple of things that we're going to do, a couple of finishing touches, just to make this window pane look a little bit more realistic and to create that perspective and that the background, the middle ground and the foreground, and so we can see what's there. I'm going to add a little latch to the window. Now to paint a latch, I suppose you try and draw the shape of a profile of a little car. So that's the back of the car. You can see that shape there, it sort of looks like a car. I'm just using black and I'm using a thin round brush so that I can do those little details. So we start with our background and all you need to do here is get the shape of it. So draw what looks like a shape of a little car. And then I'm going to use some white and do some highlights. I'm just pulling that shape down a little bit more to sort of match the size of the window pane. And the other thing, well, we can't have a latch without a little lever to open it. So I'm just drawing the shape of the lever now. Just a little line with a circle at the top. And that completes the background of our latch. Now I've washed my brush completely of black and just put some white on it. And again, while it's still drying, while that paint is still wet, if you put white on your brush and go over the black, you'll already start to get that nice texture with the gray. So just make sure you keep loading up your brush and washing your brush completely when you're using the white, and that way you can get some nice texture and lines. You can do whatever side you like, you just need to decide which side the light is going to come from and which side you want to keep as a shadow. So if you see what I've done with the white there is the lightest part is on the right side. So on the right side of the car and on the right side of the little circle knob and on the right side of the latch, I've made it all lighter. So just make sure you stick to one side. If you did it all on the left, that would probably be fine as well, but I've chosen to do the right. And just to create a little bit more contrast between the latch and the window pane, I've put a few highlights underneath. And that's really brought it to life. So now we can see those little details. Okay, down the bottom, we're going to draw the shape of a vase. My vase is going to be straight and then have a rounded bottom. If you would like your vase to go straight down, you can do that. If you don't want to do this at all, that's optional. If you want to draw something else, you absolutely can do that. All you need to do at the moment is use your black and get a basic shape of what you want your vase to look like. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did with the latch. So this is the basic shape in the background, and then we're going to use our white while the paint is still wet to create some light and some shadows and some texture. Maybe one of the trickiest things to do freehand is to make sure that you have a little bit of symmetry, because usually a vase in nature, we don't really like a lot of symmetry because that's not what nature looks like. It's not what trees look like and grass and different plants and foliage. But when we're talking about an object like a vase, we do want it to look fairly even. I just need to fix up that left side so that each side looks the same. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. You definitely don't need to draw this in or use any shapes or use any stencils. If you wanted to, you could. There's no problem with that. If you really love your painter's tape and wanted to create a really straight, sharp vase, you could put some painter's tape down and create that shape and then color it in black and then peel it off. But I've just done this freehand. So again, I've decided that my light, because the light on the latch was on the right side, and so to complement that and to match that up, the light for my vase is going to be on the right side as well. So you can see how I've put pure white paint, cleaned my brush and put pure white paint on there, but because the black paint is still wet, it creates that nice grey texture, so it fades quite nicely. Now already it's starting to come to life. We've gone from that black silhouette to giving it a little bit of shape. Just remember to try and create a little bit of a contrast. And again, sometimes my favorite tool to use for painting is my finger. So if you do find there's too much paint on there, you can use a tissue to dab some of it off if you feel like you've used too much. I tend to just use my finger and rub some of it in. If you want, you can wait for it to dry and paint over it. So I've tried to leave, and again, the light will hit on the edges. So on the left-hand side, I have done a little bit of light because the light is still hitting the vase on the edges, and its shadowy part will probably be that closer to us. And there will be a little bit of light hitting the edges, and then the inside of the vase should be a little bit darker. So I've just got my black and just making sure that the inside of that vase stays nice and dark. I'm just smoothing out my paint here because you want a little bit of contrast, but you certainly don't want it to be just lines. You want it to fade and you want it to blend. So now I'm just using my finger to blend it in. And if you don't feel like it looks the way you want it to, don't be afraid to go. I'm going over this a couple of times just to make sure I'm getting those light and shadows right. If you want to let your acrylic paints dry, you can go and make a cup of tea or do something for 10 or 15 minutes and then come back to it, and then you can layer it over really quite easily. All right, what I'm doing now is creating a stem for our flowers in the vase. And again, I've used black. If you wanted to do something that was a little bit more realistic and you wanted to use brown, or you wanted to create a different look, you could absolutely do that. I just like the dramatic monochrome juxtaposition between black and white in these sorts of paintings. It has a little bit of a fantasy vibe. It's not completely realistic, and sometimes it's nice. Again, if we look at the stems of the flowers, I've gone for the black, and then the light is hitting it on the right side. So the highlights for the stems are on the right side of the stem of the flower. And to really create some contrast, the colors of the flower, I'm going to use a neon yellow and also white. So all I've done is used a round brush, and I will dip it into both, and I'll load up my brush quite a bit, dip it into the yellow neon and into the white, and then that will create my flowers. Underneath the vase, again, to create that bit of contrast, you can see the bottom of the vase is quite light, and I've created some black shadow because the light's hitting it from the front, and then there will be shadow underneath it. Okay, you can see on my brush here that I've got some neon yellow and some white. And all you need to do is create little petals. So you start with underneath the flower and sweep up. Just doing a couple of little curves, and you can see the neon yellow as well as the white in there. I don't do anything special when I dip my brush in. I just dip it, I load it up quite a lot, and I dip the brush dab it into the yellow and then dab it into the white. With these sorts of flowers, just try not to go over it too much, because if you start going over it, that's when that starts to blend together and it loses that effect. So you'll notice I just load up my brush and do one small semicircle and then another small semicircle on the side. And then just so it's not too transparent, because neons do tend to be quite transparent, I dip it in again and create one more layer, but you'll notice that I won't go over it too much, because otherwise you lose those lovely little layers or folds of the petals. And I'm doing a third one underneath. So you start with the bottom of the flower, and those little semicircle flicks are the biggest. And then you do two smaller ones just above it. Now I'm just going to draw some leaves. And again, every time I've dipped my brush in, all I've done is wash my brush completely, dip it into the neon yellow, and then dip it into the white. And to create those leaves, you can see I press down a little bit harder, closer to the stem, and then take some of that pressure off as I get to the tip of the leaf, so that creates that point. Just doing a little bit of highlights with the white so that we've got that yellow and that white. Make that leaf a little bit sharper at the end. So you can see everything I do is not always perfect. I thought that there was a little bit too much highlight on that and I was losing some of the stem. So I went over it with a little bit of black, and now that looks a little bit better. So we've got that darkness in those highlights. After doing these few touch-ups, just to finish off the vase and the flowers, the very, very last thing I'm going to do is go back to the window pane, the frame, because we've used that beautiful neon yellow in the sunset in the center, and we've also used it in the flowers at the front. So just so that we can see that the light from the sun is reflecting onto the window pane, I am using a round brush here, and I'm just drawing painting a couple of little highlights where I think the light will hit the most. Now the light is coming through the window panes, so I've got those highlights hitting the bottom of a window pane, and that should just bring it all together. Because we've got our black and our white and our window panes, but just so that we've got a little bit of highlight from the sunset and the sun rays. And that way we've also got the light hitting the bottom of the window pane and then fading to black. So it looks like there's the perspective of the shadowy or the darkest bit should be closest to us and the lightest bit should be away from us. And again, I've just chosen the right side. I know that that's up, but on all of the window panes, I've chosen the light to be hitting on the right side. And if you wanted to do it the other way around, you could. I just thought the light would probably hit the top of the window panes and the right side of the window panes. And I've done highlights up there because the sun is closest to the glass rather than closest to the frame. And we want to keep those edges nice and dark because that's really what frames it. It gives it that dramatic look. And the sun's rays can hit a little bit more in some of the shadows. That's usually what happens in a sunset. Sun rays aren't perfect. Again, highlights closest to the glass of the window pane because that's where we're going to see the sun rays hitting. Last few highlights. And we are done.